the meaning of residency depends on the purpose for which you ask. I mean, it's one thing if you want to get, say, a exemption for your car or for your real estate because you're a local person, or maybe you're a veteran. I don't know whether Florida has it, but New York has a special exemption for real estate by a disabled veteran. But you have to be a resident of New York to get it. If you live in Florida and you own some real estate, say in the Hamptons or up in the Catskills or something like that, and you say, yeah, but I'm a disabled veteran, I want that special rate, you're not going to get it because you're not a New York State resident. So resident means a lot of different things for a lot of different purposes. Let me point out, Alaska has gone to an extreme. You can become an Alaska resident just by going there and saying, I'm an Alaska resident, but that may not mean much, because if you want to get, say, a resident fishing license, which is much less expensive than one that is, for a non-resident, you have to have been there for at least 30 days, and you have to declare that this is now my residence. On the other hand, if you want to get the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which is an annual payment that's made from some fund called the Permanent Fund in Alaska, and they've gotten everything from $500 to $2,000 a year, you have to have been a full-time resident, not just for one calendar year, but you have to have been a resident, for 12 calendar months, but you have to have been a resident for one calendar year. So if you move in on January 5, say to Anchorage, you won't be able to become a resident until 2 years from then, in effect. So it depends on why you ask. Now, one question that Alan pointed out, which is an important one, which is often a motivating factor for people moving to Florida, especially from high income tax jurisdictions like New York and California and Oregon and New Jersey. I mean, there are many states with high income taxes, including some that you might not know, like Minnesota has a very high state income tax. How do I avoid that state income tax by moving to Florida? Well, that's complicated because different states use different methods to determine whether or not you are a tax resident for state income tax purposes. Let's take New York, for example. If you're a domiciliary in New York, which of course means that that is the place where you intend always to stay or to return to, which of course is a question of fact and can't be proved absolutely, you're going to be taxed by New York on your worldwide income unless you fall under an exception. There's an exception, for example, if you don't have an abode available for your use and you spend under 30 days a year in the state. In fact, when I went out to California in 1987 to start my firm's office in Los Angeles, I wanted to fall under that rule. Now, I knew I was a New York domiciliary. I knew I would eventually return, even though my wife and kids went with me. And I put my home up for rent, so I didn't have an abode available for my use. But I didn't make it because I began arriving to New York at 11:50 at night. And part of a day counts as a whole day. And I finally just gave up. I said, I'm not going to be able to be in New York only 30 days a year. Different states use different methods. I mean, California, for example, basically has a presumption, but it's only a presumption that you're a Californian if you're there for 9 months of a year. So before you say, well, I can avoid it, I mean, I've had people tell me, well, I'm going to spend under 180 days in New York or wherever it is, and I'm golden. It's not going to work. Even if you don't meet the test that New York has, that if you are physically in New York for any part of a day, with certain exceptions which rarely apply, for more than 183 days, you are automatically a New York State tax resident, even if you can prove absolutely that your domicile, the place where you always intend to return, is Florida or somewhere else. So you've got to be very, very cautious in doing that. And I've known people who think, oh, all I have to do is to be out of New York for more than 183 days and I'm golden. You're not golden. And I've had clients pay literally tens of millions of dollars of back New York taxes. And let me tell you about the change in domicile. There's an old case in New York, decades before there was any income tax in New York and before New York had a very, very high state estate tax, in which the court said, if you claim that you've changed your residency, your domicile, You have to prove it by clear and convincing evidence, almost to the point of beyond a reasonable doubt. And we'll talk about some specifics on that. But if you are in the state more than 183 days and you have an abode available for your use, you are going to be a New York income taxpayer, even if you can prove that your heart is somewhere else, whether that's Florida or Oklahoma or China for that matter. It's just a rule which the courts have upheld as being constitutional, although that has not gone to the Supreme Court of the United States. On the other hand, if you spend fewer than 183 days and you don't have an abode available for your use, or even if you do, you still can be considered an income tax resident if you're found to be domiciled in the state. And we're going to talk about, some things, and Alan has it right here. Domicile, the place the individual intends to be their permanent home and intends to return whenever absent. But of course, today with paraplegic people all over. I mean, an executive, he works for General Electric and he spends time in New Jersey, and then they send him out to Seattle, and then they send him to Germany for a while. And then he moves to, someplace like New Mexico. Where is his home? He's been to many, many states, and his spouse may be the same way. Maybe she is originally from, let's say, Florida. But when they get married, they have kids, and all those factors are going to have to be considered. But as Alan points in it takes two factors. It takes physical presence. In theory, you cannot be domiciled in a place unless you've been there. Well, that kind of makes sense. But if you've been to a place, it can be if you can show that your intent is to make that your permanent home. But with people changing jobs and locations all the time, that's sometimes very, very questionable. And we'll get into that. The motivation intent to change domicile is immaterial. People have said to me, but I want to be a Floridian for income tax purposes. Your intent doesn't matter, for the purpose at least. Alan, back to you.
Very good. So, Jonathan, I have seen clients move to Florida, but they want to spend a lot of time in New York visiting their grandchildren. So they buy a house in New Jersey, and then they cross the river to spend time with their grandchildren. Will that work?
It's certainly better than having a home in New York. One of the couple of things that you really have to do in order to prove that you've abandoned your New York domiciliary and your domicile, and remember, it takes clear and convincing evidence. You've got to give up that big home in New York. And that's one thing people hate to do. They've built this home, they've lived in their home, that's where they've had holidays, they've had everything in the world. It's the gathering place where the kids come for the major holidays, for, Father's Day, Mother's Day, birthdays and stuff, and they don't want to give up that home. If you keep that major home, I think, and you spend considerable time there, I'd say more than 3 months a year, your goose is cooked. Yes, you're better off getting rid of the home in New York and buying a home in New Jersey, and drive to New York or take the the underground subway from New Jersey to New York, and you can do that. And you now will say, well, I was never domiciled in New Jersey, and New York can no longer claim me because, number one, I don't have an abode available for my use, so you can't be caught by the 183-day rule. And Alan, let me mention one thing about that. My wife and I had an apartment in New York City, and I got an inquiry from New York saying, oh, Mr. Blattmachr, you spend more than 183 days a year in New York City, even though your major home is on Long Island, not part of New York City. So we're going to claim that you are a New York City resident, and New York City has an additional 4.3% income tax. Well, what I did, however, when I got my lease for my apartment, I put in that I could only occupy it for 300 days a year. For 65 days, I couldn't. And because it wasn't available full time for me, the city conceded that I was not a New York domiciliary on the New York income tax payer for New York City by the count the day rule. So if you're going to spend a lot of time in New York, and there are other states that have similar rules, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania have similar rules, make sure that if you're leasing, you can't use it all the time. Maybe you could say, I'm going to rent a summer home in the Hamptons, and I can only use it from the beginning of June to the end of September. That is not going to be considered a permanent abode. And that means you won't have to worry about the count the day test. Of course, you say, well, I'm only going to be there 120 days. Well, what if you come back for Thanksgiving? What if you come back for Christmas or Hanukkah? What if you come back for a New Year's party? And those days add up, and it's up to you to make proof. And by the way, the state and the city are very good about it. I had a guy who was about 80 came to me, and he was infuriated. He lived upstate New York, but infuriated that the city claimed he was a resident. Well, I got his Easy Pass stuff and everything. He had an abode. He had an apartment in New York City. So anyway, I really got very upset with the New York City tax people. And one day they said to me, Mr. Blattmachr, people lie to us all the time. Sometimes they even lie to their lawyers. And they showed me receipts from restaurants for the days he claimed he was not in New York on his daughter's credit card that clearly he had signed her name. I had to resign from representing the guy because I had made a representation that, what we had put in previously was true. So I had to resign. And he was lucky, and I think it was because now he was only 81 or 82, but they didn't charge him with tax fraud. So don't think you're going to outsmart them by, I keep a record. I'll have my secretary keep a record. I'll have phone bills to prove that I wasn't in. Don't risk it. Because one of the problems is you can be caught for taxes in 2 states. In fact, there's a famous case that all of us read in law school when we take conflict of laws, and that's the N. Ray Dorrance case. Mr. Dorrance bought out the Campbell Soup family and made a tremendous fortune. He had a big home in New Jersey, he had a big home in Pennsylvania, and he used to kind of split his time between the two. Both states claimed that he was domiciled there when he died, so each state claimed that it could impose its state death tax on his estate. He lost in both jurisdictions, and that could happen. So if you're going to move from a state where you've always lived, like New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, wherever it is, and you're going to move someplace else, again, as Alan said, motivation does not matter. What matters are your actions and your intent, which can't be proved absolutely. But if you've got very strong ties to it, well, you're going to have a problem. Let me tell you about someone else, Alan, who just called me about it. Guy calls me and he says, I'm leaving New York. I said, you are? I said, by the way, that big, beautiful apartment you have in Manhattan, are you giving that up? Oh, no, my wife and I love it. I said, oh, that's interesting. And what about your beautiful summer home out in the Hamptons? Oh, no, we're going to keep it. We love it. But we're only going to be in the state about 125 days a year. I said, gee, that's very interesting. And we're going to spend more than 180 days in Florida. I said, that's great. I said, where is the headquarters of your business? It's in Manhattan. And I said, are you going to go there? Yes. Let me tell you something. That would be his death knell. If you've got a business and it's headquartered in your former domicile, and I've been through this with clients, you're never going to be able to convince the tax authorities that you're no longer domiciled there. Even if you're spending 100, 99, 120, 150 days, and more than that in Florida. Because where your business is exceptionally important to the determination of your domicile, as is where your kids go to school. And don't think just because you've sent them to a private school, say in Massachusetts or Connecticut, that you're going to win. Because if they're coming home to Manhattan for holidays, for example, that's really going to go against you. And again, you can be caught by 2 states. You can be caught by Connecticut and New York, or New Jersey and New York. And what you've done is double your problem. You've really got to do the right things, and all the mechanical things that you do, like get a Florida driver's license, sign that, what is it called, an affidavit of domicile, Alan? You go down to the county seat, you get this form, say, I declare that Florida is my domicile. Well, that and $2.75 is going to get you on the 7th Avenue subway. It's going to be meaningless. Oh, I gave up my New York driver's license, and I got a Florida one. It's going to be meaningless. Those things can only hurt you if you don't do them. But don't think because you've got, I got a Florida fishing license as a resident and gave up my New York resident fishing license. Not gonna work. Simply not gonna work. The best thing you can do is to get out completely. And Alan said this is a great idea. If you insist about having, a significant amount of time in New York, get a home in New Jersey. Don't get a place to sleep in New York. And really spend, I tell clients, if you move, you're going to get rid of your big home, and they cry about that and tell me I'm mean and I'm a communist or whatever because I'm making them give up this home that they love. But they have to do it, and they have to do all the mechanical things. So, go ahead and do all that. Alan, I'm getting a note that I may be experiencing network connection difficulties, or is it the audience that may be?
You're fine. It was freezing up a little bit, but it just delayed it. Everything you've said has come across. Jonathan, what do I need to know as a Florida lawyer for a client who may likely be a New York resident, and I'm doing his Florida estate plan? And if I leave the credit exemption amount to a typical credit shelter trust, and New York finds that he was actually a New York domiciliary, then he's going to pay New York estate tax, right?
Well, that's right, Alan, and that's a serious problem. Your wills, and I know you do this, Alan, you want to make sure your will works regardless, or your revocable trust used as a will substitute, regardless of where you turn out to be domiciled. But that can have tremendous consequences. For example, in New York today, if you're married and you don't have an agreement to the contrary, your spouse will be entitled essentially to 1/3 of your estate when you die, and you can't substitute a trust. But Alan, if I'm domiciled in Florida, can I use a trust to avoid having my spouse take 1/3 of my estate?
Could leave 37.5% to a lifetime trust for the spouse that pays her income plus what she needs for health, education, and maintenance after considering other issues or after considering her resources. And you can appoint Attila the Hun to be the trustee of that trust, also known as your children. So at least it makes it more difficult for that spouse to receive a lot.
Well, that's very, very important, because keep in mind that almost all states that are not community property state, with the exception of Georgia, and in Georgia there is no entitlement to a surviving spouse to a minimum or an elective share. But in many, many states, the vast majority of non-community property states, again, other than Georgia, do allow a minimum share, although some have an earn-in provision. New Jersey, for example, does. In New York, I marry a woman, we go on our honeymoon, and, the night of our honeymoon, I die of a heart attack. It was just so fantastic. Well, guess what? We've been married for 12 hours, and she gets 1/3 of my wealth. Not 37% put in trust, which would be minimal, perhaps, compared to 1/3 outright, but 1/3 outright. So if I marry an 80-year-old woman and I die on, wedding night, she is going to get 1/3 of my estate unless we've agreed otherwise. So keep in mind that it's not just taxes. There are a variety of other consequences. For example, you might say, well, what I'm going to do is I won't raise this before we get married, but I'll make my spouse sign a postnuptial agreement once we're married. Well, first of all, postnuptial agreements are kind of like believing in the tooth fairy. They rarely happen. And in fact, in Ohio, they won't respect to do it. In fact, I can tell you in California, the lawyer, and I'm a member of the California Bar, if you have someone who comes in and says, I want to have a postnuptial agreement with my spouse, you better have each spouse represented by independent counsel, because otherwise you're going to wind up in terribly hot water with one, if not both spouses. As our dear friend Howard Zaritsky said, don't make the client's problem your problem. And you will do that if you think it's all going to be okay with a postnuptial agreement. It's just not going to happen. Alan, tell us about these non-resident audit guidelines that New York has.
I don't know anything about them.
Well, again, New York has, is there another page, Alan? Because they consider, a variety of things. Active business involvement, time. Also, it's where your most important possessions are. There have been cases where someone has been able to establish that he was or was not a resident because the most important heirlooms were at a certain place. There was one case where they found a woman to be domiciled in Michigan. Why? Because her pet was buried in Michigan and her grave was going to be in Michigan. Even though she claimed she was a Floridian, when they looked at it after her death, they said, you got buried in Michigan, but more important, your dog got buried in Michigan right next to your own grave. So, these are things that people don't think about. I had one guy who had a terrible time, but what he did was he went to a lot of cocktail parties. You guys have a lot of cocktail parties for older people in Florida, right, Alan? Yeah, that's something that over Floridians do. And in fact, when he came to be a client of mine, he had been represented by Dick Covey, who, during his years of practice was clearly the leading estate planning lawyer in the United States. He said, oh, I worked with Dick and I'm not a New Yorker anymore. I'm a Floridian. Well, who am I to challenge that? Well, I began to kind of go, he would get mad at me every single time. Well, New York State came after him hammer and tong, and he wound up paying a tremendous amount of money in back income tax. Now, when we finally settled the case with New York for a huge amount of money, and I told his wife, if you don't want this to happen in future years, you really have to give up that big home in New York, which you absolutely love, and you're going to have to spend very little time in New York. But as I've said, I tell people, get rid of the New York home, rent only, rent for part of the years, which will prevent the count the day test from applying. But you're also going to have to change church or synagogue affiliations. Country clubs switch over to non-resident. If they don't have non-resident, I would suggest you resign and have one of your friends have you be able to play there as a guest of his or hers. Don't take the risk. The cost will be enormous. And do you know who's the winner on this, Alan? You might think it's the tax lawyers. It's the lawyers who are the winners because you can't prove these things absolutely. So you're going to have to really be very careful. I mean, I've thought about changing my domicile to Florida. And Alan, let me tell you what came. When I was retired from Millbank, I said to my wife, Betsy, maybe we ought to move to Florida, don't have to pay the New York tax. And she said, our only grandchildren are here in New York. We are going nowhere. And guess what, Alan? She wins on that. Now, there has come up something, a reason why Betsy and I may get divorced. And that has to do with the pending change in the current tax bill, the one that just came out this week, which says that the SALT deduction is going to go from $10,000 a year to $72,500. But you don't get it if your income is too high. Well, combined, Betsy's and my income is over the threshold. But Betsy's alone isn't. So if we got divorced, Betsy'd be able to get a $72,500 SALT deduction. And you know what I could do, Alan? And this is something that I've actually done for people. I could change my domicile and Betsy wouldn't. And let me tell you one little trick here, Alan. Let's say I've got all the assets. Let's say I'm as rich as you are, Alan. I've got $50 million. So I've got $50 million. Betsy has very, very little. And I moved to Florida. Betsy moves to Florida. The grandkids have gone down there, so she's now gone to Florida, and that's just fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Q-tip trust for Betsy. Now, Alan, she's going to create a Q-tip trust for me. Who is going to be taxed on the income from that Q-tip trust? Well, Betsy will be. Even though it's a trust for my benefit and I get all the income and I'm in New York living, the life of Riley, it's going to be taxed to her. And because she is a Floridian, there is going to be no income tax paid. So if you have a couple where one of them is willing to move, truly show a change in domicile, you can go ahead and do it and have it tax to the person who's in the state with no or low income tax, either because you put all the assets in their name, which if they're a US citizen, you can do without any gift tax at all. And then your spouse can take that and put it into a Q-tip trust for you. You're still in New York, but it's not going to be taxed to you even on distributions. And that's really something that you want to consider if you have a couple, do it. So, but it would be very tough for me because if I claim I'm a Floridian and Betsy's still a New Yorker or whatever the case may be, how do I prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I've abandoned my New York domicile? If I come up every month to spend time with Betsy and the kids and the grandkids, I think I'm going to be a little bit shaky. By the way, Alan, this came up when I was in the Army. New York has this rule that even if you're a domiciliary, if you don't spend 30 days in the state, you don't have an abode available for your use, you're not considered a New York income tax resident. And I could meet that test, even though I knew I was going to go back to New York. I was a domiciliary of New York. I didn't do it. But I was truly a domiciliary. But Betsy was spending about 50 days a year in New York, visiting and other things. And they said, well, she has to take your domicile. Even though she's from Pennsylvania and you two were just married, she has to take your domicile. Why? Because men rule. A wife in those days had to have the same domicile as her husband, even if she'd never been in the state. It's like if you have a child, let's say you're from Minneapolis, and you are living somewhere else and you have a kid, that kid automatically has the same, domicile that the father does. Now, again, someone might come and say, no, it should be the mother. But historically, a child automatically takes his father's or her father's domicile. Probably could be struck down today on a very famous Supreme Court case called Orr v. Orr, which said states can't discriminate between men and women. By the way, the state of New York finally backed down. I said, well, this is interesting. I kind of looked at this when I was in law school, and I'm going to bring a suit against you. They called back 2 days later and said, Betsy can file as a Pennsylvanian, so she doesn't have to pay New York income tax.